In 1947, a group of men gathered in a sealed room in Washington and created an organization with no clear legal limits, no public name, and no obligation to explain its actions to anyone outside the White House. They called it the Central Intelligence Agency. Since that day, the CIA has overthrown democratically elected governments, conducted mind control experiments on unwitting American citizens, funded its covert wars through drug money and fraudulent banks, and assembled the largest classified budget in the history of the United States, a figure the public will likely never see in full. This is not a conspiracy theory. Every claim in this story comes from declassified documents, Senate investigation records, and confirmed reporting. The CIA's history is not hidden because it is false. It is hidden because it is true. Over the next hour, you are going to see how a small group of frightened men in 1945 built the most powerful shadow organization in modern history, and what has done with that power ever since. Here is what really happened. The war ended in fire and rubble. By the summer of 1945, the cities of Europe lay broken, millions of people displaced, and the map of the world was being redrawn by exhausted men in overheated rooms. The United States had won the greatest military conflict in human history on raw industrial strength and the courage of its soldiers. But behind its uniform of victory, America carried a secret weakness. It was almost completely blind. The Office of Strategic Services, the wartime intelligence unit that had operated behind enemy lines, had been overwhelmed from its first day. Soviet agents had walked freely through its ranks. British intelligence had withheld critical information from American counterparts, while German and Soviet intelligence networks ran operations with precision of military campaigns. The OSS had improvised its way through the war on good intentions and borrowed expertise. President Harry Truman dissolved the OSS in September 1945. He had no great love for peacetime spy agencies. He believed the country did not need one. But the world beyond America's borders had not received the same memo. In Eastern Europe, the Red Army was not going home. In Berlin, in Warsaw, in Bucharest, Soviet influence was expanding by the week. Truman had inherited the presidency of a nation that had just won a war and now had no idea what its enemies were planning next. Something had to be built, something permanent, something that could never be dissolved by the stroke of a pen again. In the corridors of Washington in 1946 and 1947, a quiet debate was taking place about what kind of intelligence service America actually needed. The argument was not about whether to build one. Everyone agreed that was necessary. The argument was about what it should be allowed to do. The men drafting the language of the National Security Act of 1947 made a choice that would echo through every decade that followed. They made it deliberately vague. The Central Intelligence Agency was established on September 18, 1947, when President Truman signed the National Security Act into law. The CIA's mandate authorized it to collect and analyze foreign intelligence, coordinate intelligence activities across government, and, in the critical phrase that lawyers and historians would spend decades unpacking, perform such other functions and duties related to intelligence as the National Security Council may direct. Those 10 words were not an accident. They were a design. The men who wrote that clause understood that a spy agency needed legal room to breathe. A mandate with clear limits would also have clear edges that hostile powers could probe, map, and exploit. By giving the CIA a deliberately open-ended charter, Washington created an organization that could be whatever the moment required. It could advise. It could analyze. It could recruit. It could destabilize. It could overthrow. All of it could be traced back to those 10 words. If anyone bothered to look, most did not look for a very long time. The CIA was legal. It had a director, analysts, and a mandate. What it did not have was money. Not the kind of money a global covert operation requires. Asking Congress openly would invite questions about what the funds were actually for. The CIA's founders needed a pipeline that moved quietly, that left no obvious trace, and that connected to a source large enough to fund an empire's shadows. They found it in the most unlikely of places. In 1948, the United States launched the Marshall Plan, the most ambitious international aid program in history. Over 4 years, more than $13 billion poured from American coffers into the shattered economies of Western Europe. The official purpose was reconstruction, food, fuel, machinery, and infrastructure. The unofficial arrangement was something else entirely. Approximately 5% of Marshall Plan funds, declassified records suggest a figure close to $685 million, was quietly redirected to CIA operations across Europe. The money paid for election interference in France and Italy, where communist parties were surging in the polls. It funded labor unions that would counteract Soviet-backed worker organizations. It paid newspaper editors to print stories friendly to American interests. It supported cultural institutions, radio broadcasts, and political campaigns. All of it traceable, on paper, to humanitarian reconstruction. None of it obviously connected to a spy agency that the public barely knew existed. The Marshall Plan gave the CIA its financial spine. What the agency did with it would determine whether it could survive the decade. Money was secured, but the CIA's early operations were not just failing. They were failing in ways that suggested the agency was not merely outmatched. It was compromised. In the late 1940s, the Soviet KGB operated networks that had been built and refined over 2 decades. Its agents were embedded in Western governments, universities, and military establishments. Its tradecraft was meticulous, patient, and brutal. The CIA was an organization that had existed for less than 2 years. The consequences showed in blood. In one of the agency's earliest large-scale covert operations, trained Ukrainian agents were parachuted into Soviet-controlled territory to link up with resistance networks and gather intelligence. The missions failed before the aircraft landed. A key handler on the operation had been a Soviet asset from the beginning. Every man on the ground was captured or killed within days. It was not an isolated incident. Mission after mission launched in those years ended the same way. The CIA's internal assessments eventually used a phrase that could not be softened. The agency had been fatally penetrated. The implications were profound. Not only were operations compromised, but the failures were so consistent that recruiting new agents became nearly impossible. Why would anyone risk their life working for an organization that could not keep a secret? CIA Director Walter Bedell Smith, appointed in 1950, understood that the agency faced an existential question. It had failed too often and too publicly for anyone inside Washington to pretend otherwise. The next operation had to succeed. The CIA needed a moment that would silence the critics, and it needed one soon. The moment arrived in the form of a crisis 8,000 kilometers from Washington. Iran in 1953 was a country at the center of everything. It sat on oil reserves that had made the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company one of the most profitable enterprises in the British Empire. When Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized those reserves in 1951, claiming that Iran's oil belonged to Iran, London lost something it had no intention of surrendering gracefully. Britain turned to Washington. The CIA saw both an obligation and an opportunity. A nationalist prime minister who had taken oil from Western companies was, in the logic of the early Cold War, a potential Soviet asset, or at least a dangerous precedent. CIA Director Walter Bedell Smith approved the operation. It was given a name, Ajax. At its center was a single CIA officer, Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, who slipped into Tehran in the summer of 1953, carrying approximately $1 million in operational funds. Roosevelt's method was not subtle. It was surgical. He identified the levers that move Iranian society, military officers, newspaper editors, religious leaders, street organizers, and he moved them. Payments were made. Stories were planted. Protests were choreographed. The operation was built on the oldest principle in political warfare. If enough people believe something is happening, it begins to happen. Over 19 days, Roosevelt assembled a crisis that the Shah's loyalists could step into. The stage was set. The actors were paid. All that remained was the performance. The performance took place on August 19, 1953. In the streets of Tehran, paid mobs moved through the city, clashing with supporters of Prime Minister Mossadegh and creating the appearance of a popular uprising against his government. Military officers who had received CIA payments ordered their units to move. Tanks appeared at key intersections. The radio broadcast calls for the Shah supporters to rise. The momentum built with manufactured speed. Soldiers stormed the Prime Minister's residence later that day. Mossadegh escaped briefly over a garden wall and was captured within hours. He was tried, convicted of treason, and sentenced to house arrest for the remaining 3 years of his life. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, returned from Rome, where he had been waiting in a hotel room for the outcome. Iran's oil fields returned to Western control under a new arrangement that granted American companies a 40% share. In Washington and London, Operation Ajax was declared a masterpiece. It was fast, cheap, and effective. The CIA had toppled the government for $1 million and 19 days of work. The lesson Langley drew from Tehran was that covert political action could achieve what armies could not, quickly, quietly, and without attribution. What the internal briefings did not dwell on was what had been planted in the soil of Iran's political life, a deep and lasting resentment of American power that would eventually erupt in a revolution no amount of covert action could reverse. The Iran operation established a template, and the CIA applied it quickly. In Guatemala in 1954, the agency moved against President Jacobo Arbenz, whose land reform program had nationalized assets belonging to the United Fruit Company, an American corporation with close ties to several figures inside the Eisenhower administration. The CIA combined an economic pressure campaign with a propaganda operation that portrayed Arbenz as a communist agent. Mercenary forces, trained at CIA facilities in Honduras, crossed the border and advanced on Guatemala City. Arbenz, faced with military defection and loss of nerve, resigned. He spent the rest of his life in exile. But not every application of the playbook worked. In Indonesia, a CIA attempt to destabilize President Sukarno through support for regional rebel movements collapsed when the Indonesian military suppressed the uprisings, and a CIA contract pilot was shot down and captured, publicly linking the operation to Washington. In Cuba, early efforts to build opposition networks against Fidel Castro, who had come to power in 1959, produced nothing that matched the pressure his government was applying to its own domestic challengers. Inside Langley, a harder assessment was taking shape. The CIA was not naturally suited to the kind of deep human intelligence work that the KGB had spent decades building. Soviet networks were too well embedded, too well protected, and too often running their own CIA assets back toward Washington. The agency needed a different advantage. Director Alan Dulles and his deputy Richard Bissell began looking at what America was genuinely best at, not spying on foot, but building things in the sky. The decision to pivot toward technology was not a retreat from covert operations. It was a recognition that the United States possessed capabilities no other nation on Earth could match. American industry, American engineering, and American scientific ambition, applied to intelligence gathering, could produce tools that no KGB handler could recruit away and no double agent could betray. The concept was straightforward. Build something that flies so high and so fast that nothing can catch it. In 1954, CIA Director Alan Dulles and President Eisenhower approved a classified development program. The agency partnered with the Air Force and contracted Lockheed's Skunk Works Division, a secretive advanced development unit in Burbank, California, led by the engineer Kelly Johnson. Johnson's team was given a near impossible specification: a surveillance aircraft that could fly at 70,000 feet, cross the Soviet Union without being intercepted, photograph objects on the ground with enough resolution to identify individual equipment, and return safely with its film. The result was the U-2. It had sailplane wings stretching more than 100 feet, giving it the lift to cruise at the edge of the stratosphere. Its cameras could resolve objects as small as 2 feet from 13 miles above the ground. Its range allowed it to cross Soviet territory and return to Allied airfields without refueling. The aircraft completed its first flight on August 4th, 1955. Langley had invested in something that changed the balance of intelligence collection entirely. For the first time, the United States could see inside the Soviet Union. Not through agents on the ground who could be turned or killed, but through a machine that the Soviets could track on radar and could do absolutely nothing to stop. Between 1956 and 1960, the U-2 flew 24 missions over Soviet territory. Each mission returned with rolls of film that rewrote what American analysts thought they knew about Soviet military capacity. The program produced photographs of airfields, missile installations, naval bases, and industrial complexes that had been entirely invisible to Western intelligence. CIA estimates of Soviet military strength had been built largely on guesswork. The Two replaced guesswork with evidence. The Soviets tracked every flight on radar. They identified the aircraft as American in origin within the first missions, but they could not touch it. Their best interceptor aircraft could not climb to 70,000 feet. Their surface-to-air missiles of the mid-1950s could not reach it either. For 4 years, the United States conducted the most systematic aerial espionage program in history, with virtual impunity over Soviet airspace. And the Soviet leadership could do nothing but watch the radar screens and wait. Inside the CIA, the U-2 program was a vindication of the technology pivot. It had produced intelligence that human agents could never have gathered at a fraction of the risk. But the program also carried a quiet dread that everyone involved understood. The Soviets were not standing still. Their missile technology was improving. The window of invulnerability would not stay open forever. The CIA knew that AU-2 would eventually go down. What they did not know was how badly that day would shake the foundations of American foreign policy, or that would arrive on the first day of May 1960. On May 1st, 1960, CIA pilot Francis Gary Powers took off from a base in Peshawar, Pakistan, on a planned mission across Soviet territory that would have taken him over Sverdlovsk and on to a landing site in Norway. 17 minutes into Soviet airspace, at approximately 70,500 feet, a Soviet Say-2 surface-to-air missile struck the U-2. Powers survived the explosion and parachuted to the ground, where he was captured by Soviet forces. The Eisenhower administration initially denied that any espionage mission had taken place, claiming the aircraft was a weather research plane that had strayed off course. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev waited 2 days, then produced Powers, the wreckage of the U-2, and the camera film it had been carrying when it was shot down. The cover story collapsed entirely. Eisenhower was forced to admit that the United States had been conducting systematic aerial espionage over Soviet territory for 4 years. The diplomatic consequences were immediate and severe. The Paris Summit of 1960, a meeting between Eisenhower, Khrushchev, British Prime Minister Macmillan, and French President de Gaulle that had been planned as a possible turning point in Cold War tensions, collapsed before it began. Khrushchev withdrew, demanding an apology Eisenhower refused to give. The U-2 affair demonstrated that even the CIA's most successful programs carried risks that could detonate far beyond the boundaries of any single operation. Powers was exchanged for a Soviet intelligence officer in 1962. The overhead reconnaissance program continued, but from that day forward, it would be done from space. While the U-2 crisis played out in Europe's diplomatic corridors, the CIA was already deeply committed to another theater that would prove far more damaging to American prestige. Vietnam had been divided at the 17th parallel by the 1954 Geneva Accords, leaving a communist government in the north and an American-backed government in the south. The formal American military role was advisory. The CIA's role was considerably less formal. From the mid-1950s onward, CIA officers worked inside South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia in capacities that ranged from training local forces to running covert paramilitary operations that the State Department would have declined to acknowledge. U-2 flights mapped the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the supply network running from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia to insurgent forces in the south. Those maps became the blueprint for covert strikes. In Laos, a country officially neutral and therefore off-limits to American military forces, the CIA constructed an entire shadow army. Hmong tribal fighters, led by General Vang Pao, were recruited, equipped, and paid by the agency. They fought against the Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese forces, harassed supply convoys, and protected CIA air operations across the country. Air America, an airline that was officially a private commercial carrier and actually a CIA proprietary company, moved weapons, cash, and operatives into airstrips cut into the jungle. The war in Southeast Asia was growing, and so was the reach of the organization conducting it. The question of how it was all being paid for had an answer that very few people in Washington were prepared to state out loud. The shadow war in Southeast Asia was expensive. The official CIA budget could account for some of it. Congress, even with its limited visibility in declassified programs, could trace the larger outlines. But the Laos operation, the Hmong Army, and the Air America network required funding streams that did not appear in any budget document that would ever be reviewed by a congressional committee. The agency found those streams in the region itself, and the region's most reliable cash crop was opium. In the highlands of Laos, the Hmong tribesmen who fought for the CIA also cultivated opium fields that had been their economic foundation for generations. The CIA's relationship with those fields was not one of active trafficking in the conventional sense. It was something more strategic and more compromising. The agency looked away. Air America aircraft moved through the region with minimal inspection. Local commanders who controlled opium production were treated as valuable assets whose political reliability outweighed their other activities. Money that originated in opium fields eventually circulated through the same regional networks that the CIA depended on for intelligence and logistical support. In Cambodia, similar entanglements developed as the war expanded. Heroin trafficking fed into economic circuits that the agency used without fully auditing. The arrangement was never policy, never written down, and never formally approved. It existed in the space between what the CIA needed to accomplish and what it was willing to account for. By the time congressional investigators began examining the Southeast Asia operations in the mid-1970s, many of the records had already been removed, transferred, or destroyed. The war in the shadows had generated its own shadow accounting. In April 1961, the CIA launched the operation it believed would define the decade. A force of approximately 1,400 Cuban exiles, known as Brigade 2506, had been recruited, trained, and equipped by the agency at camps in Guatemala and Nicaragua. The plan called for the brigade to land on Cuba's southern coast at a location called the Bay of Pigs, establish a beachhead, and ignite a popular uprising against Fidel Castro's government. CIA analysts had assured President John F. Kennedy that the Cuban population would rise once a credible liberation force appeared. They were certain enough to stake the operation on it. The landing began on April 17, 1961. Within hours, everything the CIA had promised began to fail. Airstrikes intended to destroy the Cuban Air Force on the ground had been canceled at Kennedy's insistence to reduce the operation's visibility. Castro's Air Force remained operational and attacked the brigade's supply ships. The popular uprising did not materialize. Cuban forces were better organized, better equipped, and better motivated than CIA intelligence had predicted. Kennedy refused authorized American air cover, fearing the consequences of open American military involvement. Within 72 hours, the operation was over. 114 members of Brigade 2506 were killed. Nearly 1,200 were captured. They were eventually ransomed back to the United States for $53 million in food and medicine. Kennedy was publicly furious and privately devastated. He reportedly told associates that he would never again accept CIA operational assessments at face value. The Bay of Pigs had not just failed. It had damaged something that could not easily be repaired. The president's trust in the organization that was supposed to be his most reliable instrument of hidden power. Chile in the early 1970s offered the CIA what it considered a textbook threat scenario. Salvador Allende, a physician and committed Marxist, had won the Chilean presidential election of September 1970 in a three-way race with 36.3% of the vote, the first democratically elected Marxist head of government in the Western Hemisphere. The Nixon administration, advised by National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, considered an Allende government in Chile as dangerous as a Soviet military base. Kissinger's assessment was precise. Chile was not a country the United States could afford to lose to the left. The CIA received authorization to conduct what became known as Track I and Track II operations against Allende's government. Track I focused on political and economic destabilization, funding opposition media, supporting strikes in key industries, and channeling money to political parties that oppose Allende. Church committee investigations later estimated that the CIA spent at least $8 million on these efforts between 1970 and 1973. Track 2 was more direct. It involved establishing contact with Chilean military officers who might be prepared to act against the elected government. The economic pressure worked in coordination with political disruption. By 1973, Chile's economy was under severe strain. Inflation was acute, food shortages were widespread, and the political climate had become explosive. On September 11, 1973, General Augusto Pinochet led a military coup that overthrew Allende's government. The presidential palace in Santiago was bombed by Chilean Air Force jets. Allende died inside the building. Pinochet ruled Chile for 17 years, during which an estimated 3,000 people were killed, disappeared, or executed. Washington expressed satisfaction. The hemisphere had been held. Vietnam consumed the CIA's resources and moral credit in ways that exceeded any single operation. The Phoenix Program, formally established in 1967 as a coordinated counterinsurgency campaign against the Viet Cong infrastructure in South Vietnam, became the most controversial intelligence operation in American history up to that point. Phoenix was built on a logic that was, in its own terms, coherent. To defeat an insurgency, you had to destroy its command structure, not just its fighters. The CIA and its South Vietnamese partners identified, targeted, and neutralized Viet Cong organizers, tax collectors, propagandists, and local administrators. By the program's own figures, Phoenix neutralized more than 20,000 Viet Cong operatives between 1965 and 1972. Captured documents, turned informants, and disrupted supply networks represented genuine intelligence successes. The program damaged the Viet Cong's ability to operate in certain provinces for periods of months or longer. In the narrow metrics the CIA used, Phoenix worked, but the methods used to achieve those results. Interrogation techniques that violated the laws of war, extrajudicial killings carried out on the basis of informant accusations that could not be cross-checked, civilian casualties that damaged the very population the program claimed to protect, created a legacy that outlasted the war itself. Phoenix became a symbol of the cost of effectiveness without accountability. Its methods appeared in congressional hearings, in journalism, and eventually in international discussions about American conduct in armed conflict. The CIA's operational successes in Vietnam were real. What they had cost was a question the agency was still answering decades later. While the CIA fought its wars in Southeast Asia and South America, a different kind of operation was running inside the United States itself. Project MKUltra, formally approved by CIA Director Allen Dulles on April 13, 1953, began from a genuine intelligence concern. American prisoners of war returning from Korea appear to have been subjected to techniques that altered their behavior and beliefs in ways that conventional psychological understanding could not fully explain. The CIA wanted to know what those techniques were. It also wanted to know whether they could be replicated, refined, and used. What MKUltra became was something that went far beyond any defensible intelligence objective. At its peak, the program ran at least 150 separate research subprojects across more than 80 institutions, universities, hospitals, prisons, and CIA safe houses. Subjects were administered LSD without their knowledge or consent. They were subjected to days of continuous electroconvulsive therapy. They were isolated in sensory deprivation chambers. Hypnotic suggestion techniques were applied to unwitting participants. The goal, as internal documents made clear, was to determine whether human behavior and memory could be controlled, erased, or redirected through chemical and psychological intervention. The program ran for 20 years. When CIA Director Richard Helms ordered most MKUltra files destroyed in 1973, in advance of congressional investigations into CIA activities, the physical evidence of most of what had been done went with them. A filing error left approximately 20,000 documents intact. Those documents, discovered in 1977, confirmed enough of the program's scope to produce Senate hearings that shocked even senators who had spent years overseeing the intelligence community. The CIA had experimented on Americans. It had done so for 2 decades, and it had destroyed the evidence when it sensed discovery coming. The Church Committee hearings of 1975 were the most significant public examination of American intelligence activities in the nation's history up to that point. Senator Frank Church of Idaho chaired a select committee that over 14 months produced 14 reports documenting CIA assassination plots against foreign leaders, domestic surveillance of American citizens, mail opening programs, the MKUltra experiments, and the full scope of covert operations conducted since the agency's founding. The hearings were broadcast. The testimony was often devastating. The revelations produced immediate consequences. The CIA's budget was cut. Overseas stations were reduced in number and staffing. The number of experienced officers who retired or were forced out in the post-church period significantly degraded the agency's operational capacity in ways that would not be fully appreciated until the 1990s. Executive Order 11905, signed by President Gerald Ford in 1976, explicitly prohibited American government employees from engaging in or conspiring in political assassination. For the first time, the CIA had a formal boundary it was legally prohibited from crossing, but the committee's work also produced a more ambiguous outcome. Inside the CIA, many officers concluded that the hearings had been less a correction than an attack, that congressional oversight was a form of intelligence bleeding that weakened the country while its enemies watched without constraint. The resentment of the Church Committee era never fully dissipated inside Langley. When the next opportunity to restore the agency's reach and funding arrived, and it arrived in the form of a Soviet invasion of a country the size of Texas, the CIA was ready to move, with or without the kind of public accounting the committee had tried to impose. Iran-Contra was not a single operation. It was a system, a private foreign policy apparatus constructed inside the Reagan White House and run through the CIA and the National Security Council staff, designed to do what Congress had explicitly prohibited. The Boland Amendment, passed by Congress in 1982 and strengthened in 1984, prohibited the use of federal funds to support the Contra rebel forces fighting the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. The Reagan administration was determined to support the Contras regardless. The question was where the money would come from. The answer came from an unlikely direction. In 1985, CIA Director William Casey and National Security Council staff, including Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, established a channel through which the United States sold arms to Iran, a country publicly designated as a state sponsor of terrorism. The transactions were conducted through Israeli intermediaries to maintain distance from Washington. Iran, fighting a war against Iraq, needed the weapons. The proceeds were marked up, and the profits channeled to a private account that North managed. From that account, millions flowed to Contra operations in Central America. The arrangement unraveled in November 1986 when a Lebanese newspaper published an account of the arms sales. Congressional hearings followed within weeks. The televised testimony of Oliver North, alternating between defiance and contrition, became the defining image of the scandal. Multiple indictments followed, though many convictions were later overturned. CIA Director Casey died before he could be called to testify. The Iran-Contra affair confirmed what critics of the intelligence community had argued since the Church Committee, that without genuine oversight, the CIA and its allied agencies would construct their own foreign policy when they believed the official one was insufficient. As the Iran-Contra hearings played out in Washington, a financial institution that had served as one of the CIA's most useful covert conduits was approaching its own collapse. The Bank of Credit and Commerce International had been founded in 1972 by Pakistani financier Agha Hassanabedi, with initial capital from the Abu Dhabi royal family. It grew into a global network of more than 400 branches across 78 countries, offering financial services to clients that conventional banks refused: dictators, arms dealers, drug traffickers, and intelligence agencies in need of untraceable transaction channels. The CIA had used BCCI's web of shell accounts and correspondent banking relationships to move funds for covert operations in Afghanistan, Latin America, and the Middle East. The bank's opacity made it ideal for payments that needed to leave no audit trail. Informant payments, black market arms purchases, and funding transfers to allied intelligence services moved through BCCI's books without triggering the reporting requirements that legitimate banking channels imposed. By the late 1980s, investigators from multiple countries had begun piecing together the scale of what BCCI had facilitated. The figures eventually documented were staggering. More than $23 billion in fraudulent transactions, money laundering for Colombian cocaine cartels, payments to officials in 73 countries, and confirmed use by intelligence services including the CIA. On July 5, 1991, regulators in 62 countries moved simultaneously to shut BCCI down. The coordination was itself a remarkable intelligence achievement. What the closure revealed was an equally remarkable portrait of how the CIA had built its shadow financial infrastructure across 4 decades, and how dependent it had become on institutions that operated entirely outside the law. The collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991 was a defining geopolitical event of the second half of the 20th century for the CIA. It produced something close to an identity crisis. The agency had been built around a single adversary, an adversary that had shaped its budget, its personnel, its training, its technology investments, and its moral framework. When Mikhail Gorbachev resigned the Soviet presidency on December 25, 1991, and the red flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time, the CIA found itself in the position of a military force that had won a total war and now had no orders for the morning after. The KGB, the CIA's great rival, the organization that spent 44 years studying, penetrating, and outmaneuvering, was dissolved. Its successor services were smaller, underfunded, and disorganized for years. The intelligence networks the CIA had built across Eastern Europe to monitor Soviet activities lost much of their purpose. Station chiefs in Warsaw, Prague, and Budapest filed reports on transitional governments that were, for the first time in their country's histories, genuinely aligned with Western interests. In Washington, the post-Cold War logic was applied to the intelligence budget with brutal consistency. Stations were closed. Experienced case officers retired without replacement. Recruitment of new officers slowed. The assumption, shared widely across the Clinton administration and Congress, was that the reduction of the Soviet threat justified a corresponding reduction in the intelligence apparatus that had been built to counter it. The peace dividend was real. What no one could see clearly from Washington in 1993 was what was growing in the spaces the CIA was quietly abandoning. In the mountains of Afghanistan and in training camps in Sudan, an organization was assembling itself that bore no resemblance to the threats the CIA's budget and personnel had been structured to address. Al-Qaeda had emerged from the anti-Soviet jihad of the 1980s, a conflict the CIA had enthusiastically funded and armed, channeling billions through Pakistan's intelligence service to mujahideen fighters. Osama bin Laden had been one of the prominent financiers of that jihad. He had not been a CIA asset in the direct operational sense, but he had existed in the same ecosystem of weapons, money, and religious motivation that CIA covert action had helped construct. By the mid-1990s, bin Laden had redirected al-Qaeda toward a new adversary, the United States itself. The CIA tracked him, analyzed his communications, and produced assessments that described the threat he represented. The agency identified multiple opportunities to act. In 1998 and 1999, proposed operations to capture or kill bin Laden were developed and then set aside because of concerns about collateral casualties, because the intelligence was insufficiently certain, because the political risk of a failed attempt outweighed the perceived urgency of a successful one. The USS Cole bombing in October 2000, which killed 17 American sailors in Aden Harbor, produced another round of assessments without action. Meanwhile, bin Laden's network was financing and planning an operation on a scale that no analyst had specifically anticipated. The warning signs were present in the CIA's own files. The connections between the pieces were never assembled into a picture clear enough to generate the emergency response they warranted. The summer of 2001 produced intelligence reports that described al-Qaeda's intent to strike inside the United States in broad terms. None of them stopped what was coming. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, 19 al-Qaeda operatives hijacked for a commercial aircraft in coordinated operations that killed 2,977 people and fundamentally altered the trajectory of American intelligence policy. The attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon represented the most devastating foreign attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor. They also represented the most catastrophic intelligence failure in the CIA's history, a failure to connect known information about al-Qaeda's operational presence inside the United States with the warnings about impending attack that the agency's own analysts had been raising for months. The political and institutional consequences were immediate and sweeping. The CIA's budget, which had been declining in real terms through the 1990s, exploded. New authorities were granted, new programs were authorized, and new partnerships with signals intelligence, military special operations, and foreign intelligence services were formalized at a pace the agency had never experienced. The 2002 National Security Strategy Doctrine of Preemption gave the CIA legal and political cover for actions that would previously have required extensive justification. In 2002 and early 2003, CIA Director George Tenet and senior analysts presented assessments of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction capability that proved, after the invasion of Iraq in March 2003, to have been fundamentally wrong. No stockpiles of chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons were found. The intelligence had been built on defector testimony that had not been adequately verified, analytical assumptions that had not been rigorously challenged, and political pressure from an administration that wanted the intelligence to confirm a decision it had already made. The absence of weapons in Iraq became the CIA's second-grade intelligence failure in 2 years, and the agency entered the mid-2000s carrying the weight of both. In the mountains of Afghanistan and the tribal areas of Pakistan, al-Qaeda's surviving leadership moved constantly, changing locations, avoiding phones, using couriers rather than electronic communications. Traditional methods of finding them, informants, surveillance teams, signals intercepts, were all applicable but all limited by the terrain, the time required, and the risk to any American personnel deployed in those regions. The CIA needed something that could stay in place longer than any human asset, see more than any camera on the ground, and strike faster than any military unit could be assembled. The Predator drone had first been used for surveillance in the Balkans in the mid-1990s. After September 11th, the CIA pushed to arm it. The AGM-114 Hellfire missile was integrated into the Predator's airframe, creating a weapon system that could loiter over a target for hours, confirm identity, and strike within seconds of authorization. The MQ-9 Reaper, introduced in 2007, extended the capability further. Larger payload, longer range, higher altitude, and the ability to carry multiple Hellfire missiles alongside precision bombs. Pilots sitting in ground control stations at Creech Air Force Base in Nevada flew missions that were occurring in real time over Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia. Satellite links connected the aircraft to its operators across 12 time zones. Infrared sensors allowed the aircraft to track human movement in total darkness. High-resolution cameras could read the markings on a vehicle from miles above the ground. The CIA's drone program moved from experiment to primary counterterrorism tool within 5 years of 9/11. Hundreds of strikes were authorized across 3 presidential administrations. The program was not publicly acknowledged for years. When it finally was, the debates about its legality, its effectiveness, and the civilian casualties it had caused would occupy courts, journalists, and human rights organizations for a generation. For nearly 10 years after September 11th, Osama bin Laden remained the most wanted person in the world. He had escaped the siege of Tora Bora in December 2001, disappearing into Pakistan's tribal borderlands with the American military in pursuit. The trail went cold for years. The CIA ran operations based on partial intelligence and came up empty. The search consumed enormous resources without result. Inside the agency, some analysts began to question whether bin Laden had already died of health problems in the mountain terrain he was hiding in. The break came in 2010. CIA analysts studying courier networks that bin Laden's organization used to communicate without electronic detection identified an individual known as Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti. Patient surveillance tracked al-Kuwaiti through Pakistan to a large compound in Abbottabad, a mid-sized city about 35 miles north of Islamabad. The compound was unusual. High concrete walls topped with barbed wire, windows that faced inward rather than outward, a third story with a privacy wall around its terrace, no internet connection, no phone lines, and a burn pit that handled all waste rather than leaving it for collection. CIA analysts studied the compound for months before concluding with high confidence that it was bin Laden's hiding place. Operation Neptune Spear launched on the night of May 1st, 2011, 4 modified Black Hawk helicopters and a CH-47 Chinook crossed into Pakistani airspace without notification to Pakistani authorities. SEAL Team 6 assaulted the compound, clearing it floor by floor in approximately 38 minutes. Bin Laden was found on the 3rd floor and killed. His body was removed from Pakistan and buried at sea before dawn. In the Situation Room in Washington, President Obama and his national security team watched a live feed of the operation. The hunt that had defined the CIA's post-9/11 decade was over. The CIA that existed in the 2020s bore little physical or operational resemblance to the organization Walter Bedell Smith had tried to rescue from mediocrity in 1950. Its black budget, according to documents leaked in 2013, exceeded $14 billion annually for CIA alone, part of a broader $52.6 billion total U.S. intelligence community budget. It operated in more countries than its founder could have imagined, through more technology than they could have described, against adversaries who had not yet existed when the National Security Act was signed. Palantir, the data analytics company founded in 2003 with early investment from the CIA's venture arm in QTEL, had given the agency a platform that could ingest phone records, financial transactions, travel histories, drone footage, and social media data and surface connections between them that no human analyst could find working alone. The CIA's Directorate of Digital Innovation, established in 2015, represented the formalization of what the agency had been moving towards since the U2 era. The belief that technological superiority was a more reliable advantage than human espionage alone. China now occupied the strategic position the Soviet Union had held. Beijing's intelligence services had demonstrated capacity to conduct operations, cyber theft, influence campaigns, human recruitment, at a global scale that matched or exceeded anything the Cold War KGB had attempted. The tools were different. The logic was the same. The CIA had begun as a small group of frightened men in a sealed room, trying to see a world they could not afford to misread. 8 decades later, it was still doing exactly that, with a budget, a reach, and a capability that would have been unrecognizable to men who had written the words that set all in motion. From the rubble of 1945 to the drone feeds of the 2020s, the Central Intelligence Agency has been a mirror held up to the nation that created it, reflecting both its deepest fears and its least examined choices. The story does not end here. It is still being written in classified rooms and digital operations centers that the public will not hear about for another decade, or perhaps another generation. If this story made you see history differently, subscribe, because the next story is one you will not believe either.